I mean, if you think of
Good
the
evening. This is Adam Sturch, broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Angel Fire. Alright, I'm going to take a flat brush and start giving some wisps, as I've done here, and around these since the last time I videoed, and just give it a little more detail before the next layer of yellow and magenta glazing.
Indeterminate and delicately balanced enough system that it can actually resonate to the presence of the morphogenetic field, then you begin to have a theory of what the psychedelic experience is. It's the experience of the transcendent dimension of every object. And every object has a transcendent dimension, but more than one. I mean, it has a dimension which extends into the past, it has a dimension which extends into the future, and it has a dimension which is orthogonal to any of these, that is the internal horizon of its own transcendence. Now, this kind of talk is Whiteheadian talk. Whitehead, in the 20s and 30s, actually created a philosophy, a rigorous metaphysic, entirely capable of working in a psychedelic environment. Had he written it in Sanskrit, he probably would have had a wider audience, but he wrote in plain English. So if you're interested in a metaphysic of the psychedelic experience, where you actually take it seriously and say these things which we perceive, the dissolution of boundaries, the recombining of form, the transience of form, the transience of meaning, the coming together of actual events in a real world, and the dissolution of those events into a world of potentiality. This is all Whitehead type stuff. Some of you may know the notion of memes. A meme is the smallest unit of an idea. It's to ideas what genes are to biology. And memes compete in the same way that genes are competitive in an environment. A meme can be copied. I can tell you something and you can tell someone else. The meme has been copied. A meme can be repeated. I can say the same thing over and over again to different people who then copy it and take it away. But in the same sense as a gene is only effective if it remains faithful to its original, the meme must remain faithful to its original. And the only way we can correctly copy these memes and pass them among ourselves is through clarity of understanding. So it's always this pressure on clarity. Nothing should be ambiguous. I don't believe in it. I believe that understanding passes everywhere, and that a thing is not existentially apprehended in some sense until it is understood. And as far as what understanding is, it's simple. It's nothing more than the perception of connecting pattern. So that here is a data field. Could be a beach full of people, or a great corporation, or the history of England. A data field. What patterns do you perceive in it? The more patterns you perceive in it, the more you understand it. And there is no bottom to this. I mean, understanding just falls through the phenomena of the world endlessly. Essentially, it's about communication. That most of what we say and do, even though we may define ourselves as wide-ranging intellectuals, most of what we say to each other is incredibly animalistic and low-grade data exchange, because we're not used to pouring the energies of cognition into articulate speech. We just tend not to do that. But actually, it's at this stage of things the closest we can get to hardwired telepathy. Honest, straight talk that draws from as deep as it can, and a search for, well, Blake said this thing, let's see if I can get it right. He said, the truth, if it is told so that it is understood, must be believed. In other words, if you hear it and you understand it and it's so, you will automatically give allegiance to it. This is because we resonate with some kind of ground of being that is below the speakable and yet supporting it. So the idea here will be to try and communicate between ourselves to create a slightly different kind of reality than everybody else is hanging out in. Mostly, I hope, our reality will have more hope than the generic reality that's going on outside. Because I think that there's a lot of data on the table now, more information than ever before. And we can actually begin to figure out what's going on, not in terms of the first 3 milliseconds of the universe, but actually, what is going on this planet? What is human history? What is a cognizing species doing, running around by the billions on the surface of this planet, obsessed with religions and driven by vice and hatred and visionary longing? This is not what they talk about in the biology books. Still less is it what they talk about in the physical chemistry books. And something has torn loose on the surface of this planet, and we are embedded in it, and we are it, and it is sweeping us and all life on this planet into some kind of apotheosis, some kind of shit-hit-the-fan situation where all the hopes and dreams and fears and obsessions are going to be held up to some kind of transcendental inspection. Nothing can stop this. Perhaps, it could have been stopped in the 12th century or the 6th century, but now technical processes, population growth, information transfer, destruction of the environment, we have the great dying is well underway. And the question is, does this make sense? And an even more cogent question, can it be made to make sense? In other words, can we come to, in the situation of a planet sinking into chaos, and somehow run around and punch some buttons and close off some areas and salvage something? Can meaning be salvaged? Or is the process that has gone on over the last, you pick a number, but it's in the billions of years, essentially meaningless, dumb show and absurdity? The really freaky thing about this, I think, is that it's not clear, that it seems to rest in the domain of human decision, that the universe is not at all what we suppose it to be, and that we are in effect presented with a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, 11-dimensional koan, a labyrinth, a puzzle, a kind of conundrum which has to be cut through. And it's all done in the mind. The whole apparent world is actually syntactical in nature. This is what they don't tell you in the philosophy departments or the physics departments, that the universe is made of words, and that there has to be a speaker and there has to be a hearer. Photons, quarks, anti-newman, that's not what it's about. That is a linguistic model that floats above the bedrock of syntactical connectedness that mind travels through to create networks that it interprets meaningfully. That's what's really going on. situation years and years ago, knowing and feeling what I've essentially just said to you 25 years ago, I've always been a skeptic. I mean, I've always been sort of on a downer, cynical even, and take things apart and belittle them and see how they tick. It's just it's a male, rational style, scientific style. And the assumption behind that is that you can reduce the whole world to something which is non-threatening and neutral somehow. But a weird thing happened on the way to completing this program, which was I discovered something which it is my intention to try and share with you. I don't know, it's many people have made this discovery, but I can only speak for myself. So for me it had a very intense and kind of transformative immediacy. And this was, I discovered that in the realm of the so-called transcendental. I was raised Roman Catholic, and in the process of cutting that loose, switched to Latin for Sanskrit for a while, and I've had a lifelong interest in the transcendental, but basically from a debunking point of view. In other words, not for me sweeping up at the ashram, not for me the ambiguities of Babaji. I mean, and in India, the tack which I always took with these people was, what can you show me? You know, anything. Because talk is cheap. God, if I don't know that, who does? So a line of patter is completely non-convincing. Well, it's not to be found in those traditions. What I'm trying to say is that when I put pressure on the spiritual domain, the only people who could deliver were shamans with a history of use of hallucinogenic plants. And an awareness of this came to me, say, as early as 1967, and I began to pursue it. At first I pursued a pharmacological basis behind Tibetan shamanism. The pre-Buddhist shamanism of Tibet is called Punpo, and I went there thinking that their art could not possibly be what it is unless they had access to hallucinogenic plants and were using them. Well, I was 22 years, I didn't know anything. I didn't speak these languages. I had no notion of the task that I was setting up for myself. But later I went to the Amazon basin, and there is an extant and thriving, a rich shamanic tradition of hallucinogenic plant use, and they can just convey you into astonishing dimensions. And it's those astonishing dimensions that will form inevitably the focus of what we do this month, because we need to run it as a headline. It goes something like this. Scientists discover nearby hyperobject in alternative continuum. It's that sort of thing. It's that by pushing the psychedelic experience, we can satisfy, and let me define pushing there, I mean putting a great deal of research pressure on the tryptamines. By pushing the hallucinogenic psychedelic experience, I think we could fairly quickly satisfy ourselves, if the legal climate were different, that the Freudian model won't do, the Jungian model won't do, and that in fact all psychological models will fail, and that what we're dealing with is something quite of another order. And I am not one to reach for, the metaphors of spirit with the connotation of moral opprobrium and all that, but there is a dimension which is accessible to each and every one of us. This is the primary thing about it. It's accessible, that is so appallingly, titanically, and bizarrely different from the continuum that we're currently residing in, that it seems to throw doubt on the entire effort to understand the world as it's been carried out over the past 1,500 years. In other words, there is an object in this mental space which, as culture-creating creatures, we are attempting to colonize and invade this cultural space through the concrescence of language. In other words, through exteriorizing our ideas as tools, we are invading this cultural domain, and the psychedelic tryptamines, and very recently discovered, by the way. I'm doing a book for Bantam, and I have to go through the whole history of these things, and to my amazement, the indole hallucinogens actually were never studied. LSD was invented in 1938. They put it on the shelf for 5 years. Then the guy took it, Hoffman. He said it's a hallucinogen, but the war was raging. That was 1943. It didn't actually make its way into the journals until 1947. Then, from 47 to roughly 65, there was a great deal of interest in LSD and research on it. Then that ended with it becoming illegal. Meantime, psilocybin, DMT, and the beta-carbolines, the number of articles and papers published on these things, numbers in the dozens. In the case of DMT, it's under 10. We're talking now human experiments, not rat slicing and physical chemistry, but actual human data. So what we inherit out of the 60s, one of the ways which we have been disempowered that we didn't even know, it was fun to learn a new way that you were disempowered that you didn't even know, is that the LSD experience was made the paradigm of the psychedelic experience. And it was placed at the center of the phenomenological mandala, and then all these other compounds were sort of related into it in terms of doesn't last as long as, lasts twice as long as, that sort of thing. When you think about this alternative reality and the exploration by drugs with psychedelic drugs, and then the pervasive problem with other sorts of drugs in the society, and it cuts very close to the core of ourselves as creatures. I mean, we are addictive animals. We addict to everything. We addict to each other and glorify it as our most noble outpouring of sentiment in the phenomenon of romantic love. I mean, when a pair of lovers are parted, the withdrawal symptoms are indistinguishable from heroin. I mean, vomiting, shaking, uncontrollable emotional outbursts, sleeplessness, short-temper, hysteria. This is real. It is what romantic love is a pheromonal bonding, an exchange of chemical messengers which takes these two autonomous organisms and welds them into one galaxy of need and intention and understanding and expectation. Well, then you just tear that apart and people are, shook up. We addict to political ideals, all kinds. I mean, it's wonderful what's happening in Peking, but Several decades ago, the same thing was happening in Berlin to a different beat. People find an idea and it works, and all barriers appear to be movable and all goals attainable. We addict to things. This is like magpies, but then through media trained to propel ourselves into ever more extensive relationships with objects. We invent money, which is kind of a multi-transformable drug. It stands for everything, everything you ever wanted, and you can addict to money. Nevertheless, what I will argue during this month is that that this is not a bad thing, that we have a secret history that I will try to convince you of, and you should try to convince me that I'm wrong, and we will argue over the secret history of the human race and why it is, therefore, that we are as we are, and why it is that these psychedelics are not some peripheral issue of screwballs who can see God in a cabbage, but that, in fact, the issue of psychedelics is directly on the tracks of the onrushing locomotive of rationalist, paternalist, schlock society, and that it ain't going to go away. Because what we're talking about here is a nude part of the human mind. What we're talking about here is something which takes its place in the great unfolding of the defining of human freedom that characterizes the entire adventure of global civilization. In other words, we've got the Pope under control. That happened in the Middle Ages. Slavery has now been generally embraced as a bad thing to be into, and we've gotten that on the books as a bad idea. Women have been suddenly recognized to be human beings, and so forth. So this swelling bubble of aha and perception of the real nature of the universe should also include the sudden realization that governments have no business telling people what foods and spices they should prefer, that this is an absurd role for government, and that, like slavery, like the subjugation of women, the legal persecution of dietary habits has just got to take its place with the high-button shoe. And we will talk a lot about the consequences of this. What does it mean? Because you see, what the government would have us believe, and perhaps believes itself, although I doubt it, is that we would return to the beast. That's all. We would just shoot junk and toot blow and flop around in ruinous orgies until hell froze over. And they, wiser, sterner, more disciplined than ourselves, represent the edifice of moral authority. This is a I'm doing it for your own good trip, see? And actually, this is all hypocrisy, and we will talk about that, the roles of governments in the promulgation of drugs and drug cartels, and how, this is what I learned doing this book for Bantam, is that drugs have always been there and have always been manipulated by governments. I mean, this is almost what money was invented for, was to do dope deals. And, I'll show you what I mean as we get into it. But I want to return for a minute to the transcendental object, because that's the part which gets me off the most. It's taken me a long time to believe what was actually happening, in that I always said I read it in the newspaper, but I can't believe it because it's happening to me, or it's happening so near to me. But I just, it hardly now seems to matter. And what we just have to do is to try and talk frankly based on the experience which each of us brings to this about, the thing. How much of it have you seen? Well, what do you think? How does it cast its shadow into your life? What is it? Because I talk on these subjects, I am a sort of a nexus point for
Alright, I didn't realize I had some of the frame clipped there.
And I see
But I also redid the grass with some sap green and the remainder of the magenta glaze to start giving it a little more texture and life.
Here, quite to its heart's content, while hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of people, exactly
So
like
that's that
ourselves,
for the moment
are
on this.
logging in.
And that sets it up for the next layer of glaze, which will be bright yellow and then more magenta. And then I think I may be able to start working on some of the foreground elements as soon as I get the sunset clouds to my liking. So that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. It's Adam Sturch podcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Angel Fire. Have a good night.